This is the interview of Professor Henk Verbiest, a Professor Emeritus of Neurosurgery of Utrecht University in the Netherlands, for the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, June the 25th, 1991, taken at the 9th European Congress on Neurological Surgery in Moscow. Professor Verbiest, I wanted to ask where you were born. You told me earlier.
I was born in Rotterdam. I'm rather old, in the year 1909, on the 16th of July. It was the city of Erasmus.
Yes, very much the city of Erasmus. Did you continue your education in Rotterdam?
I did my secondary education and the Latin school in Rotterdam, and then I went to Leiden University to study medicine. And I graduated in the year 34, and then first I specialized in neurology psychiatry.
What originally had attracted you to enter medicine?
That I can tell you, that's a very strange story, because my sister, the second child of my parents, was born and she developed speech disturbances. She had anarthria, she couldn't articulate words and she couldn't write. And otherwise she was completely normal and she's still alive. It's a very difficult life, and he was the elder brother and he had to teach her all the time by speaking, and it did fail. But that was the beginning that I developed an interest in the function of the central nervous system.
I see. Is that what led you to study medicine?
I suppose it's always interpreting feelings and tendencies, but it was such a puzzle for a young boy, and then growing up and seeing such a female develop and the worry she is in, it's quite a thing.
What field was your father in?
My father was director of a shipping company and of the only whalefare we had in the Netherlands. And so he was a very exact man. And my mother was she had the wisdom of life, what I say, the life sciences, yes.
Did you have any brothers and sisters who went into medicine or the sciences?
No, but my wife, her father, grandfather, great-grandfather was a doctor, and her brothers are doctors, and so our son-in-law has become a neurosurgeon, and we hope that the grandchild will follow that trend, but you never know, of course.
Did you attend a gymnasium in Rotterdam?
Rotterdam, yeah.
And then you had a competitive examination for
state's examination at the end.
How did you happen to pick or choose the University of Leiden to go to medical school?
Well, Leiden was near Rotterdam, but it was also the oldest university in the Netherlands, which was founded in 1572 because of the resistance of Leiden against the Spaniards. So it was founded by William of Orange. It's a very famous university, and it's known of its free-mindedness in science.
I noticed on some old books that could not be published in France, that they were published instead in Leiden.
Yes. Yes, because you know Descartes was forbidden. His books were burned by, how do you call it? I do not know, the hangman. He had to burn on the public place the works of Descartes. So Descartes fled to the Netherlands.
Yes.
And we had another man, Spinoza, who came to the Netherlands. And the funny thing of the Netherlands is that they are not very agreeable to countrymen, to compatriots who have other ideas, but they are very hospitable to foreign people.
Is that still true today?
I suppose so.
Who were your most memorable teachers at Leiden?
Well, I can tell you a funny story. When I had to pass my first year's examination, the first year, I was so happy to come to Leiden that I studied philosophy at the same time, and so I failed my first year examination, and the examiners told me that I had to return 1 year later. And at the same time there was a competition presented by Leiden that you should do experiments on pigeons whose cerebral hemispheres had been removed. And so with 2 co-students, we did that study. We operated you couldn't do that anywhere today. We operated at our homes, we nourished them, and then we found out the subcortical nystagmus. We didn't know the importance of that, but it was the first time that the subcortical optokinetic nystagmus was found out. And so we got a prize, and so we had a very easy examination, and I was protected. That was a funny thing, but those are things, yeah, they come without you. Those
Yes.
are the lucky moments.
Yes.
You need them, otherwise
Yes.
it's a difficult life. And so I was promoted, and during 4 years I did histology, the anatomy of the brain, and I made preparations of the development of the pigeon's brain and what happened with decortication. But then I found out that histology was not violin dingue, as you call it. It was
Yes.
not what I liked most. I had no special talents for that. And then came the opportunity to become a resident in the neurological department, and there was Professor Radermaker, who was taught by Magnus and de Klein. You may know
Oh,
those
yes,
names,
sure.
in Utrecht, and he came to Leiden. And then he remembered our early examination of the pigeons, and then I got a place, and that was my second good luck.
Yes.
It's a series of good luck.
In a way, I'm reminded by those pigeon experiments of the much earlier experience of Florent on
Florence, the Frenchman, oh, of course, yes.
on the cerebellum of the pigeons.
Yeah.
But
That was the development of the theory of cerebellar function, right? You are, yes. Yeah.
So this was a elaboration using more refined
We didn't know
technique.
Florence at the time.
Oh, you didn't?
No. Because this was cortical physiology, and I do not remember that Florence did so much in pigeons with cortical.
I
It was
see.
mainly the cerebellum, wasn't it?
Yes.
You will agree?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Very crude because
Yeah.
it was so
Oh, yeah.
early
Yeah,
in the
but still
technique.
amazing.
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 Who were
that
your teachers in neurophysiology and anatomy at
Now
Leiden?
that was when I arrived in Leiden, Eindhoven, the man, the Nobel
Yes,
Prize winner, he
yes.
had died, and his successor was Professor Radermaker, and he started as a professor in neurophysiology, and later on he became professor of neurology because the faculty says we believe that new ideas in neurology will be more fertile if they are nourished by neurophysiological thinking.
Yes.
Because before we were taught with disease units, you know,
Yes.
and symptomatology, and what he did was a sort of neurophysiological analytical neurology.
Yes. And when you finished your training in neurology and psychiatry, what year was that?
I was registered as a neurologist, psychiatrist in the early 38.
Had you been influenced any way at all by Egas Moniz's
Not at that time. Not. I was very. My teacher Radermaker had married a French woman, and so he went often to Paris. And he was a big friend of Guillain and of Garcin, and he had known of Clovis Vincent because Clovis Vincent, as you know, had been a neurologist.
Yes.
He was a self-made neurosurgeon, and then because I had in the clinic to prepare patients who had a brain tumor to be operated upon. And they went to the Department of General Surgery, and it was quite sure when he had an interview, the last interview with those patients was the last interview before their death, because the
Yes.
general surgeon had no notion about how to operate brain tumors.
Yes.
But because there was only one neurosurgeon in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, he could do it. And then we make with the residents a small revolution. We said we don't want to send the patients anymore to the Department of General Surgery. And the faculty was very worried. And then we made a list of all patients who had died. And then they said, well, we will send the patient to The Hague, to Arnold de Vet. You may know that name. He
Yes.
was the secretary,
I
one of
don't-
the initiators of the World Federation in
Yes.
the early times.
I know the name. That's one.
The vet, VET. And then Radermaker said, I will speak with Clovis Vincent and try that you get an appointment. And then there was Professor van der Hoeven, you know, the ophthalmologist,
yes.
too, and those two spoke with Dr. O'Brien of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Now, he was the secretary or administrator
Alan Gregg.
for the medical
Medical
side in
yeah,
Paris.
Yeah, in Paris, yeah.
Yes. And It is worthwhile, I think, mentioning at this point that Alan Gregg, for reasons I'm not sure, had a particular interest in the neurosciences and their development in Europe at that time.
Yeah.
He sponsored, through endowments of the Rockefeller Foundation, the work of Professor Spielmeyer in Munich,
Yeah.
and also he, with the assistance of the Ministry of Education in Paris, established the first professorship or chair of neurosurgery at the University of Paris.
Yeah.
And he also instituted a number of scholarships to enable various European doctors to come to the United States, and in turn a good many younger neurosurgeons traveled to Europe as a consequence of this.
Yeah.
Alan Gregg has often been forgotten today, unfortunately, and Dr. O'Brien as well, for their contributions to neuroscience.
Yeah.
When you arrived at Professor Vincent's service, that was at La Pitié?
At La Pitié, yeah.
I wonder if you might tell us a bit about it and how it differed from the Salpêtrière, and why neurosurgery concentrated at La Pitié with more neurology at the Salpêtrière.
Well, the story of Claude Vincent is a very particular one, because he started on his own in the Rue Boileau in a private clinic, and he did it on his own expenses. And he had two sorts of fees. Either you paid nothing or you had to pay, I think it was 2,000 francs. It depended. There was nothing between. And if the family had to pay 2,000 francs, they should be at the last consultation and hear what the professor said. Otherwise, they wouldn't pay. And we were sitting there, the whole family was listening to what Vincent was thinking that he would do. It was a big service in La Pitié Hospital, because in the Salpêtrière there were about 30 beds, and there were 200 beds.
You mean 30 beds for neurosurgery?
Yeah, and there were 200 for Clovis Vincent.
But Salpêtrière is huge.
Yes, but neurosurgery was
primarily psychiatry and neurology.
Yes, that's it. And the 200 beds were dispersed in two wards, two large wards, and there were 4 rows of beds. 2 rows like this and 2 opposite rows below the windows.
Yes.
And there was not enough control. So they always put the patient in bad condition between 2 patients who were rather good. And during morning visit, they asked the neighbors, how did he behave? Did he drink his tea? Did he drink his wine at 5 o'clock? And so on. And farmers came, and they were in the normal dress, because they had no underwear, and they were lying in those beds, and it was something very particular. I will never forget in my life.
What was he like as a person?
Well, he has been described as having the head of an aristocrat and the body of a farmer. And that was him.
But the brain, though.
Yeah, the brain, but the eyes and his hair and his way of looking. And in the morning, in summertime, he went hunting at 6 o'clock in the morning. At 8 o'clock, he entered La Pitié Hospital to operate. And then we cleaned our hands in a sort of, how do you call it, where you put your hands in?
Alcohol basin.
Alcohol basin. And when his hands had been in, it was brown and black. And we always tried to avoid that, because it was so dirty. The forest was in it. And then he started operating, and he did very meticulous work.
Similar to Dr. Cushing, then.
Yes, he was a slow operator, but very, very careful. But so I learned with Clovis Vincent to be careful. He will speak about the other thing. But what I learned from Clovis Vincent, he was a very original man. And if you read in the books on neurosurgery at that time, the complications after a brain operation were hematomas and the symptoms of But Vincent said, it's an error to think that the patients die because of their brain disease. They die in their internal organs.
Yes.
And that inspired me so much that after the war, I said to myself, Vincent, we must look at the lungs, we must look at saturation. And slowly we developed an intensive care unit that was completely inspired by Clovis Vincent.
And this is a very modern idea today, still,
For Vincent, that's very, and he has written, I have the French publication, I have cherished it because it's so particular that the man teaches you look to his internal organs, and that perhaps is the greatest gift he gave me.
Who were some of the other colleagues in training with you at the time?
There was Lebeau,
Yes.
who, and then there was a remarkable man, I will never forget, he was a Strasbourg, Mark Klein. And Mark Klein had later on had a difficult life. He did neurosurgery, but rather isolated man. But he was for me the catalyzer to become a resident. That's so funny. He helped me in every way because, you know, there were many foreigners and everybody was elbowing to assist the patron and to be there to look, and you always had to creep between the people. That's easy,
Yes.
huh? No.
Well, and was Professor Udar
No, he is younger.
He
is
came
younger.
along later.
Yeah, he came along later.
But
yeah.
you mentioned Dr. Guillaume, who was...
Guillaume, the ophthalmologist, a very charming man, and Berdet. And you know, Pio del Rega Ortega, who he did his silver impregnation.
He would send his specimens to Del Rio Ortega.
But he had been for a time
Yes.
in Paris, and then he went to Montreal, I suppose.
Yes.
And Berdet, who was taught by him, he did the silver impregnation. I've seen that being done there,
Yes.
and it was quite a gain in the diagnosis of gliomas. Yeah.
What how many years did you spend at La Pitié?
Well, then when the war broke out, Dr. O'Brien told me, if you want, you can go to the US. And I had a destination to be mobilized, and I was stupid enough to go back to Holland because I thought it's my duty. And when I arrived in Amsterdam at the depot, as they call it, for all people who are working abroad, they told me, what are you doing here? So I was completely unhappy. But then I got a post because it was late and they wanted a neurologist and a psychiatrist in a military hospital. I could go to that military hospital, and the chief was a pediatrician, also a man who was mobilized. And he said, well, it's bad luck for you. If you work in the evening in the hospital, you may over days go to Utrecht neurosurgical center to Dr. Lenshoek, and then you may, if he will help you, you can during daytime continue your training. And it was good fortune too, because Lenshoek had been a general surgeon, and whereas Clovis Vincent did very careful, slow, meticulous surgery, this man was brilliant. I have seen remove meningioma of the torcular and open the torcular, and his very precise, rapid reactions. And so that was the other side. Clovis, who respected the brain, and he had some flair in operating. And I am very happy that he have had both teachers,
Yes.
because they were very inspiring, each in his own ways.
Yes. But the administration of the medical services at the universities in the Netherlands during the occupation, or at least the early part of the occupation, was that entirely independent of the German administration?
No, you know that the war began early in what was it, late August or September 1939, and the occupation happened in May, and then in September Dr. Lenshoek was called to Amsterdam University because Oljenik, the first one, who was a neurosurgeon, he was a Jew, and he fled. He had hired a boat and he could cross the North Sea. And then he was appointed later on in Cornell University as associate professor. And Lenshoek went to Amsterdam, and Utrecht was without a neurosurgeon, and the Germans immediately occupied the neurosurgical department.
I see.
And then I received hospitality in a Deaconess Hospital in Utrecht.
I see.
And then in 1942 the Germans left and we could work in that department, and then in 1944 the Germans put a munition train, because we were built near the railway, just at the border of the neurosurgical clinic. And Monday morning the Canadian Air Force came and bombarded, but the train had left already, but befehl is befehl, although they came and bombarded our department. And
Did you have Red Crosses on the roof?
we had Red Crosses in it, but no, they wanted to hurt the railways, but it was so near, it was 10 meters difference.
Yes.
And then the patients who were alive and fled. They were killed. The comatose patients, the bad wards, were not. And I wanted to go downstairs, and then there was a hand of a nurse who said, "Here." And I do not know. I have seen her latest. And I said, "Why did you do?" She said, "I didn't know, but I had to pull you back." And because she pulled me back, she saved my life. It made 4 meters difference. Otherwise, you wouldn't have talked together.
Now that hospital, was it considered, the Deaconess Hospital, was it considered a private hospital?
That was a private hospital, yeah. So we couldn't do very much, and during the last year, during the liberation, there was no electricity. And we worked with batteries of piles.
Yes.
And we had to sterilize our instruments with a big pot, you call it a pot?
Yes.
With a wooden fire below it, because on the day on the liberations, there was the underground moved up, and they wanted to capture German soldiers, but there was just a battalion that returned from Russia, and they shot back, although there were many wounded. And on the day of the liberation, I've been operated from the morning until midnight with the little lambs.
But during the period of occupation, at least in Leiden or Utrecht, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, who looked after the people who could not pay, the poor people? Was that under German administration too?
No, that was under Dutch administration.
So it was just peculiar to your own city, Utrecht.
Yeah. Yeah, it was peculiar, and we have never had problems. If you, when I came in Utrecht in '39, a third-class bed, it was cost 2 guilders 50 cents, and now it cost 600-700 guilders. So you can see the rate of inflation. And that was no problem to care for patients, and because the cost of Medicare was much lower with the methods
You
we
had mentioned that when the German occupation occurred, shortly afterwards, the Reichsprotector, is that his correct name?
Seyss-Inquart, yeah.
Had stated that he wanted the people in the Netherlands to lead a normal life, that they would not be troubled. And
In the beginning it was quite friendly, nothing would happen, and we were all of German origin, we were friends, and everybody was a little bit tranquilized, with the exception of our government. With the Queen, the whole government, ministers fled to London. That was a good thing.
Yes.
And they warned us through radio, don't trust the Germans. And soon it came out, because the first thing they were doing was persecuting the Jews. In Amsterdam, they buried off a part of it, and well, I don't like to speak about that, but yeah.
Now, during the liberation, which occurred over several months, really, you mentioned before the interview began about emergency, what in English we would call underground medical services. I wonder if you could tell us something about that.
Well, in the first year of the occupation, when it came out that it became very difficult, because the Germans wanted that we became a member of the Ärztekammer. That was the German organization of Nazi doctors, and then we began to refuse them. But then it became clear that we needed an organized resistance, and that organized resistance movement was called the medical contact. That was the word. Was a word that didn't reflect any underground activity, but that was it. And they worked very good. Regularly we got instructions how to behave. And sometimes we disagreed, but we had to do as they did, because if everybody would follow his own way, that's no resistance. Huh?
When did the underground in the Netherlands commence its great activity? Was this in the spring of 1945, the last winter and spring of 45?
Now, the great activity of the medical contact was, for instance, the treatment of resistance people.
Yes.
When they were shot down, and sometimes they were hidden, and so they should even be treated with surgery and so on, and be introduced in a clinic under a foreign name and under another diagnosis, you see. And there were many practical things. Huh? I think that was the biggest support doctors could give to the resistance, because the other people, they did the bad work, but the doctors had to treat. Huh?
But they were operated upon, treated in the regular hospitals, but under an assumed name.
Under another name and under another diagnosis also, and they got artificial bandages and so on. Yeah. But the fact is that never a German has entered our department during the whole wartime. That's the funny thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
At the end of the war, how did you resume your career then? Was it in a professional capacity at a university, or did you continue for a while in a private hospital?
When I arrived in Utrecht, I could have an appointment, and he had an appointment in the beginning, but with the Nazi occupation, we couldn't have an appointment in the university unless we declared that we would never offer resistance against German measures. And one of the rules of our underground movement was not to adopt any position, not to give promises of anything. So I was on a freelance basis active in the university too. And then after the war, after liberation, and I got an official department as in the beginning as head of the service, and then in 1949 I became a lecturer, but it was still under the domination of neurology. That was the system of Professor Brouwer. Professor Brouwer, when I came to Holland, Professor Brouwer was the Pope of neurology and neurosurgery. And my former chief, Professor Rademacher, because it was the intention that I should become a neurosurgeon at Leiden University. But you know that when the Germans made their statement about the Jewish professors at university that they had to leave, then we had a famous man in Leiden University who made the official speech, which was even on loudspeakers on the gracht, that the Germans behaved against the law. And when Professor Cleveringa had finished his talk, the Nazis were waiting outside and put them to a prison camp. And the students in the meantime had made a post before the house and tried to protect his wife. They didn't touch his wife.
What was his name?
Cleveringa.
Cleveringa.
Cleveringa. A jurist.
Did he survive the war?
He survived, fortunately he did, yeah. But then the university was closed during the whole wartime, and my former chief went to Amsterdam, and so I could work in Utrecht. But still, I had to present myself to Professor Brouwer, and Professor Brouwer, who's a famous man, but he said, Dr. Verbiest, I will tell you how I consider a neurosurgeon. The neurosurgeon is my brains, and I am the neurosurgeon's hands. And so the neurosurgeon was completely dominated by the neurologist. And the same happened in Utrecht. And in 1949, I became a lecturer, was still young, I accepted it. And then came in 1961 the professorship. But then I should accept the surveillance by the neurologist, and I refused. He had to wait 2 years, and then the minister asked, "It's strange, you wanted to have a chair in neurosurgery, but it's not occupied." And then they went to me because I did nothing. I did no resistance. I simply continued. And then when they told my story, it was so easy, he hadn't to fight. They said, well, you should be appointed and be independent. And then in 1963, it was an independent department, and still is.
But close relations, I assume, with neuro.
Very close friendships afterwards. Before there was no friendship because there was always a little bit of suspicious.
Before we leave the earlier years, had you known Professor Kappers, Ariens Kappers?
I have known Ariens Kappers, yeah. He was... he worked with Elizabeth Crosby, the second edition of a mammalian brain.
Yes, comparative neuroanatomy.
Comparative neuroanatomy. I have known him. He gave very long speeches. He knew a lot about everything, but it was not very inspiring. He was too much. He went into details.
And Professor Beamont?
Beamont, yes, the successor of Brouwer. Yeah.
He worked with you at Utrecht?
No. He was appointed successor of Brouwer in Amsterdam.
Oh, in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
And then, commencing in 1963, I associate, at least as far as I can remember, that period with the development or origin of your interest in spinal surgery. Am I correct or not?
Well, yes. Yes, I have three interests. In the beginning, I had interest of necessity. That was aftercare. And then I had a good fortune. There was a very gifted young anesthetist. And he was working with the general surgeon, but he wanted to to give the post-operative treatment, to have a deal in it. And then they became troubles and difficulties, and he was thrown out of the Department of General Surgery, and I took him in my department. And that liberated me from a big deal of aftercare. He organized it with internists and all those things. The second point was there were no neuroradiologists, and we did all the diagnosis on our own. And so I have made, for instance, with Philips image amplifier, the first angiogram of the human brain, and we transported the patients to Eindhoven, and that has been published in the Swedish Acta Radiologica. And
What year was this? What year?
That was about, I do not have the list of my, approximately, it will be in the late 50s. Yeah. And then I did another method of slow flow angiography and isolated filling of small parts of ventricular. We had all to develop on our own.
Yes.
But in later years I got more interest in the spinal cord and column, because I thought that we should introduce our part of the neurosciences with the biomechanics of the orthopedic surgeons.
Yes.
And that's the reason that I founded also, I do not know whether you know the journal Neuroorthopedics. It's in its 6 years. I'm the editor-in-chief. We have a big board, and we try to survive. It's not so easy. Yeah.
What do you feel have been your most important contributions in the area of neuroorthopedics?
Well, I think what was very good luck was what I described in the early years about stenosis. I didn't know in the beginning the importance of it, because in the beginning it was refused by many journals, and then I got it in the orthopedic journal, and then afterwards I got a letter from a very important person of the American Railways, and they said whether I wouldn't like to write a little bit about the epidemiology, because, and then they said it's so rare, it's not worthwhile to do it. And afterwards, it spread just like an epidemic, no?
Yes.
But at the time, I thought that it was extremely rare. And then I myself have all the periods of my life I've been interested. All the time appears something new about stenosis. That's the funny thing of the disease.
Were you initially discouraged by the surgical results?
Not so much about, no. On the contrary, I must say, because we started measuring in the early years, and we did perhaps a bit too much decompression, but in any case, the main symptom, neurogenic intermittent clausus, was the most curable of all the signs and symptoms.
Are we speaking now of lumbar?
Lumbar, yes.
I meant
that
cervical.
Was, the Sturvel that had been done in later years by Spillane mainly. He described, and I limited my attention. And then what I did in the beginning, saying that if you make a diagnosis, you have to take into account the motion segment, that was Junghans, the properties of the hard tissues, and the third thing was the capacity of the canal. That was what I think my contribution. And then later on we found very curious things about the multiplicity of disc herniations, frequency of disc herniations above the level of 4 or 5. Which it has in common with achondroplastics too, who have the same.
Do you believe that there's primary degeneration, perhaps inherited in some manner, affecting the mucopolysaccharide of the disc in some individuals, making them, or some other element, making them more prone to develop spondylosis and...
You know, I understand what you mean. The first thing I did, if you see my early English papers, I have introduced the word idiopathic because we didn't know the cause, and then developmental stenosis, not congenital. And developmental, I found it out in the Oxford Dictionary, because in the 19th century the word developmental had been used for development after, but it was a little bit vague concept. And now if you see the first edition of Churchill's dictionary, they have introduced in the modern sense the word developmental, and even say it's better than to use, and that's different from the word congenital. But in my latest research now, I believe that it is a form of osteoblastosis, and that the hypertrophy of the bone in a canal that physiologically is narrow, not pathologically. And if you get that osteoblastosis, then it narrows the canal more.
Yes.
And the other point is that I find many other types of hyperostosis associated with spinal stenosis.
Some years ago now, there was an attempt at trial in stenosis of the use of calcitonin, derived from salmon, to relieve intermittent claudication. Have you had any experience with this?
No, I haven't. No.
It does not seem to work.
No. It would surprise me if it does.
It would me too.
Yeah.
As far as your work with reanimation, you mentioned the anesthesiologist, and earlier the important paper, the influence of the paper of Clovis Vincent on you, to regard the other organs of the body as being of paramount importance in the recovery of patients with head trauma.
And then we had that famous French anesthesiologist Laborit.
Yeah, Henri Laborit.
I have been through the artificial hibernation, but then you must have the intelligence of a god to be suspicious of everything, because you take over the government of the whole body, and you can't. You make mistakes, and we have done it very thoroughly, and Laborit has visited me. We have discussed everything, but afterwards I thought that the body is too intelligent for us to deliver it to us and not to do its own way, so we stopped that.
But in the earlier years, did you institute in the 1960s artificial ventilation?
Yeah.
Controlled ventilation.
We had very good German apparatus to do that. Huh? That the automatic ventilation, the early apparatus were very difficult, huh? And you never could leave them. Huh? But it was, and then we had to train our nurses. Huh?
Yes.
And perhaps that's also internet. You had Agnes Marshall, who worked with Paul Busey, and I had sent my head nurse to Agnes Marshall, and then she said, you know, you should found a society for neurosurgical nurses, and we started in Utrecht.
Oh, Agnes
went to Utrecht, yes, she came to Utrecht, and our nurse was Sister van Duivenbode, who wrote also the first book on neurosurgical care for nurses. She was the president of the Federation of Neurosurgical Nurses, the second, and I mean, it was in Tokyo she gave a presentation. And in Holland it was not so difficult with the neurosurgeons. It was difficult in Germany. In France it was difficult because they did in the beginning not find the adequate nurse, because you must have somebody who's motivated and acts a little bit against the patron. Huh?
Yes.
Because the boss is they must resist, huh? They must insist on their own capacity. But now it's in the whole of Europe. Huh?
Yes. But in those early years, would you also monitor the arterial blood gases?
Yes, but what I mean, and I was speaking about nurses, because you need very much the help of nurses. They must
certainly
become experts, and we didn't have that. That was the problem.
Certainly.
And then we tried to give them a little bit higher level so that they would accept higher responsibility.
Would you utilize urea in those days to try to reduce?
We have done that, yes.
Did you
we be afraid the rebound reaction.
Yes,
Huh?
and then did you substitute mannitol?
Mannitol we have done too, but only during operations. Huh?
But not for acute closed head injury without a surgical lesion?
No, we never did. No.
Do you utilize steroids?
Yes. That we did systematically, although it's very criticized. It's criticized.
But do you larger doses now than you once did?
We
larger amounts?
You must know, I retired at 80, and then we used a moderate doses and not the large doses as yet, because the large doses have other complications, because it was already discussed, the use of it with gastric hemorrhage and even kidney problems.
Do you have any thoughts over the past several years of the directions that research ought to take or might be promising to take with reference to improvement of cerebral blood flow and cerebral edema from severe head injury?
Oh, sure.
What steps, what measures do you think in research that seem...
Well, I think the nuclear medicine can contribute a lot with PET and so on. You know it's the same expression. Yeah. But it's very difficult, and my department, yes, my successor is working together with the Belgian Liège, where they do the PET examination, but then you need the transport of patients.
Yes.
It's not that easy.
And your other interests, hobbies, do you have interests outside of beyond medicine?
Yes, I am organ player, and I am very much interested in linguistics. You know the book of Tanner that makes such a noise in the US? The significance of language for women and for males and females.
No, I don't.
And that failing contact between male and female often is used because difference of interpretation of words, of the use of sentences, the active form, the passive form. So and theoretical linguistics, because it's used in ideologies, it's used in sciences, and all sorts of things.
Are you interested in the endocrinological differences in the brain maturation of the male and female?
No. But I am very interested in the ways they use the language, and it's very difficult you cannot do experiments on the brain, so you do not know what structures.
Women are said to be more verbally expressive than men. Is this, do you think, in your experience, true?
Well, I think there are men who are very expressive and little expressive, and the same happens to arrive as females. Don't you think so?
Yes. Do you have an organ at home?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
In the beginning I had a real pipe organ, but that made too much noise, and my rooms were not adapted to that, and so I have now an electronic, and I have more voices that you can play with Vox Humana.
Who are your favorite composers?
Bach, of course. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Well, the whole old period, we have a very famous Dutch organ composer, Zweling, and that's very nice music too. And among them, we have a very good Dutch composers for organs. You know, we have many good organs in the Netherlands. It's known for its many organs. And
now that you are a professor emeritus, you still remain very active in neurosurgery.
Yeah, that's because of the kindness of other people. I get the possibility of doing still research in the University Hospital. I have an extremely good successor. And the good thing is that he has other interests as I had. He is working with, he's Tulken, and he works with bypasses. And I work with a neuroradiologist and a neurophysiologist. We try to find out a little bit more about neurogenic intermittent claudication and those things. And imaging, of course, the imaging techniques. And
So you don't really expect to retire ever fully from neurosurgery?
As long as other people think that my brain shouldn't stop doing the work, I would prefer to be a little bit active,
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Verbiest, for providing an excellent interview. It's a great privilege to have interviewed you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, it's what you want.
It was great.